Hello everyone, welcome to video number 6 in the Spartan Vortex Setup series. In this video we will do tail setup. So just 3 things before we get started. Make sure do not have your tail servo plugged into the Vortex just yet. Number 2, make sure however you're going to power your Vortex that the input voltage does not exceed the rated voltage for your tail servo. And number 3, ball positioning on your tail servo horn. If you reference the Vortex user guide under tail rotor linkage setup, there's some information there that will suggest to you ball placement and depending upon the size of model you're working with. Now I'll be setting up the Vortex on a 450 size, so I've mounted my control ball in the 7.5 millimeter hole. So once you've got all that squared away on your model, go ahead and power up your transmitter and Vortex. In the data pod, get to the setup menu and scroll down to tail and press S. In this screen we will set our servo type. Now I'm using a 760 microsecond servo, so I've chosen that option. Do not guess at this, okay? You need to know the exact specs of your tail servo so you can set this accordingly. So choose the option that matches the specs for your tail servo and press S. At this point, you can connect your tail servo, and then once you've got that done, we'll get on with servo direction. Now, you'll need to have your servo horn and linkage connected to the servo here, but it does not need to be 90'd or perfectly centered, because all we're going to do now is make sure your servo is operating in the proper direction. So don't worry about trimming it yet. So once you've got your servo horn and linkage attached, then we'll go ahead and operate the rudder stick and watch your tail and see what kind of movements you get back there. So if you're not sure of what movement to expect from your tail as you give it left rudder and right rudder, go ahead and check the manual for your model and it will tell you which direction your tail should be moving for left rudder and which direction your tail should be moving for right rudder. Okay, so in my case I need to select the reverse option. So you do what is necessary in the case of your helicopter. Set the proper direction in the data pod and be positive about it. Okay, make sure you check this for certain, and once you've selected the option that applies to your helicopter, then go ahead and press S. Now we get to servo trim. Now the Vortex has driven the servo to the center position. This is a lot like trimming the swash servos, except for we only need to accomplish 2 things before we leave this servo trim step. One is proper positioning of the servo horn on the servo, and number 2 is proper positioning of the tail control lever right back here. Okay, so 2 things we need to accomplish before we leave this servo trim step. So if you could go ahead to your servo and without doing any trimming in the data pod just yet, attach the servo horn so you get the best 90-degree relationship between the servo horn and the push rod as you can mechanically. So if you got lucky like I did, you won't have to apply any trim. But if your servo horn is not 90 degrees, it's just a little bit off either way, go ahead and adjust the trim in the data pod so you get that servo horn a 90-degree relationship between it and the push rod. Once you have that, before we leave this step, go back to the tail and check the position of the tail control lever. That's this right here, okay? The linkage attaches to it under the boom. In some cases it might attach to yours above the boom, but either way, check the position of this tail rotor lever. If you're not sure how it's supposed to be positioned, check the manual for your model and it will tell you the proper position that it needs to be in when your servo is centered. If it's not in the proper position, you need to adjust it, and of course you do that by changing the length of the linkage, and there will be a ball link on either side of the linkage. Go ahead and adjust those ball links until you get the proper position of the tail control lever. So once you have that done and you're confident that your servo horn is 90'd, then go ahead and press S. Here we get to servo endpoints, and you'll notice that the Vortex has driven the servo to one side, and we'll adjust the endpoints for that side. So there's two different categories of endpoint adjustment. One is you'll adjust the endpoints to the maximum throw without binding. The other is that you'll adjust your endpoints to a certain point of travel. And in the case of my helicopter, my manual wants me to have a 0.7 millimeter gap on this end. So I will go ahead and adjust for that gap by using the data pod till I get my 0.7 millimeters recommended in my manual. If you're not sure where you need to set your limits, check the manual for your model, and it will guide you on how to set the limits. Okay, when you've done that, look in the data pod screen. There will be a value there. Mine says 111%. Whatever value you get when you're done adjusting your limits, go ahead and write that value down on a piece of paper and press S. Now the Vortex has driven the servo to the other side, and we'll do the same thing. My manual recommends that I have an 11 millimeter gap here. So I will adjust my endpoint until I get an 11 millimeter gap. And you go ahead and adjust your endpoint according to the specs in your manual, and when you're done making those adjustments, take note of the value that's in the data pod. Mine's a 116. Okay, whatever value you ended up getting, go ahead and write that down on a piece of paper, and after you've done that, press S. Okay, as you've noticed in the data pod, you are out of tail setup and it's back to the primary menu for setup. So before you consider yourself completely done with tail setup here, we need to do one thing. Those numbers that you wrote down, we need to total them up and see what value you get there. Now refer to the setup guide for the Vortex. In the tail section at the very bottom, there's an important note. It wants the sum of the endpoints to be greater than 200% for optimal performance. So I got 227 for the sum of my endpoints, and I'll call that good, and I'll start preparing for my first flight. But if the value that you got is something that is way off, like lower than 200 or super high, maybe higher than 250, you might want to consider an adjustment to the location of the control ball on your tail servo horn. Depending upon the value you got, high or low, you would make an adjustment in or out on your servo horn, and then you would have to go back through tail setup to get some new numbers. So if you do have to make an adjustment, go ahead and do that, then go right back into tail setup, and I'll show you what you need to do here. You can skip through this section since you've already set it. Skip through this. Servo trim. Just make sure you still have the 90-degree positioning of the servo horn at the front and proper position of the tail control lever in the back. Then go to endpoints. Now because you changed the position of the ball, you're going to have to readjust the endpoints here. So go ahead and readjust, write down your new number, go here, readjust, write down the new number, and then press S. You get back here. Now take those new numbers, total them up, and see what you get. If your new total value falls within a range that is acceptable to you, taking into account the recommendations in the setup guide, then you're done and you can start preparing for your first flight. If you need to make a further adjustment, go ahead and do that. If you need any guidance on anything in tail setup, then go ahead and check the Vortex knowledge base on SpartanRC.com, or log into HeliFreak and ask your question in the Spartan Vortex forum, and we will get you help with whatever issue you're having as quickly as we can. So I thank you for watching this video and the rest of the videos in the Vortex Setup series, and I hope you have a great time and a great experience with your Vortex.